Welcome back to Free Speech Nation. Later in the show, I'm going to be turning agony uncle with the help of my panel, Josh Howie and Scott Caporo, and we're going to help you deal with your unfiltered dilemmas. So please do email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk, and we will do our very best to answer your issues. Are great composers, such as Mozart and Verdi, an imperial phenomenon? Undergraduates learning music at Cambridge are being told to decolonise the ear and listen to sound in a post-colonial way. And elsewhere, at the University of Salford, sonnets have been called products of white Western culture and dropped from a creative writing course. Joining me to discuss this now is Mo Lovatt, a writer, academic and national coordinator for Debating Matters. Mo, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me, Mo. What do you make of this idea of decolonising the ear?
I suspect it's a very tricky process, and that's why you need a degree from Cambridge to do it.
It sounds quite painful, doesn't it?
I mean, yes, it does. And, you see the reaction, or you hear the reaction from the audience about these suggestions that you could decolonise the ear. You know, it's somewhere between comedy and tragedy, isn't it? It's making for a Shakespearean play for sure. I mean, I think on the one hand it is incredibly stupid. On the other hand, it's incredibly worrying because... I think this whole kind of decolonising the curriculum and decolonising our ears and our feet and whatever, I think all of that is sort of narcissistic in a sense, because on the one hand they're arguing that we can just get rid of 700, 800, 1,000 years worth of the canon, the literary and musical canon of Western culture. So how arrogant is that, to kind of assume that that's something that you can just decide to do? And on the other hand, as we know, all narcissists are deeply self-loathing and they self-sabotage. So what they're doing is they're sabotaging art, culture, music, poetry, sonnets, plays. They're sabotaging this because what they are doing, they are kind of making art and culture so fraught with difficulty, so fraught with a kind of new orthodoxy of the way in which you have to interpret the canon, or you have to interpret even new works, that it loses the whole point of art, which was one about expression, freedom. It was also, it's no coincidence that going to the theatre is called a shared experience. So what Chris was talking about earlier about how it kind of divides us from each other as well. We're all sort of slightly frightened that we might have the wrong interpretation of a piece of art, or we might have the wrong interpretation. And you can see, artists themselves, when they're programming things or when they're making new pieces of art, they're so frightened that they're going to be cancelled. So in actual fact, although this may sound ridiculous, and this is Cambridge University, right?
Well, that's right. And why Mozart? Why Mozart? I mean, Mozart, this is, from what I can see, his only crime was being a white male.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is the mental gymnastics you have to go through to get from Mozart to colonialism is ridiculous. But we know that this kind of new sort of ideology is ridiculous in many senses. I think they think it's internally coherent. But it does seem that anything that is associated with that period of Western history is automatically deemed to be colonialist.
Well, it strikes me that these people are seeing the world through this prism of group identity. And then you get people like, there was a video from Sheffield University saying the only reason we study Shakespeare, Chaucer, Virginia Woolf is because they were white. And I'm thinking, you don't know much about literature, do you? That's the thing.
Exactly. And I think the problem is, what I find really horrible about it is so much of this work of art comes out of the Renaissance, or it comes out of the Enlightenment. It comes out of a kind of a period of liberalisation of thought and culture that was about the fact that we can connect to each other on a universal basis, that we're all the same. So what they're doing is that they're kind of reversing that kind of impetus and saying, actually, we're all different because you will interpret things differently depending on the most banal things about you, like the colour of your skin, or what you've got dangling or not dangling between your legs, or or who you choose to sleep with. These are not what makes a person.
Yes.
These are just accidents of birth. And what art always does is it has a transcendental quality and also a humanising quality in that it gives us a shared human experience.
Is maybe one impulse behind this just the triumph of the mediocre? Because I remember seeing one writer, and she was talking about how we really shouldn't study dead white males like Ernest Hemingway. We should study more diverse people. And then I read her writing, and I was like, this is terrible, right? So it's almost like the crabs in the bucket. Because she can't do it, she wants to pull down great writers who can.
Well, there are some really good artists, contemporary artists, who speak out about this thing, and you can see that they get what art is, they get what culture is, and they're concerned about this in the way that you and I might be. But it's quite often administrators, isn't it? And it's kind of the people who can't. You know, there's nothing wrong with looking at the canon and saying, is it time to put new writers in?
Sure.
You know, Toni Morrison was added quite recently. You know, I would be happy for Andrea Levy to be added to the literary canon. You know, there's so many people that you could kind of add to the canon, but this isn't about this. This isn't about art. This is about the imposition of a new kind of elitism that, and, you know, you see it in what Chris was saying earlier. It's a very top-down imposition of a new kind of ideological way of looking at the world, which excludes people and separates them.
But it's not good for anyone, isn't it? I mean, we end up with this form of cultural immiseration. I mean, if you take this attack on the sonnets, I found absolutely bizarre, which obviously, you know, came from Petrarch through Thomas Wyatt through Shakespeare. Yeah. You know, it has this lineage. And again, all I can see that they're picking on is the skin colour or gender of the writers involved. And that is completely and that would deprive students of these opportunities to study these really important pieces.
I mean, that's absolutely right, isn't it? There's nothing wrong with revolutionising the format of poetry if you want to. But I'll tell you a good example of why I think it's important that we kind of take the best that has been thought and said and build upon the shoulders of giants. I once went to an amateur choir to learn to sing jazz. OK. Now, jazz is quite complicated. You have to understand the rudiments of music in order to be able to improvise. And in our first session, the session leader said, OK, everybody, let's do some improvisation, and played a key. And you had all these middle-aged women like me who'd never sung before trying to improvise without knowing the rudiments.
Yes.
Right? There's something about understanding the building blocks of culture and the forms and the structures, and then you can play with it as well.
Yeah.
But this isn't about the form of a sonnet, because what on earth could be offensive about iambic pentameter? There's nothing offensive
I don't see how
about
it could be particular.
But it's very much about a cultural mindset, and like you say, it kind of reverts to the kind of mediocre in a sense.
Yes.
And what I find particularly offensive about it is where they say that we have to make poetry more accessible to students of colour because it's too difficult to be accessed by students of colour. I mean, that is racist, right?
Well, I would have thought so. I mean, I remember hearing one charity talking about how we should be teaching black students about Stormzy instead of Mozart because they couldn't possibly engage with Mozart. That strikes me as a soft form of racism to me. It's the bigotry of low expectations.
I agree with you, and what I found really, really shocking is that, because you probably know I worked in the arts sector for a long time, and after that kind of Black Lives Matter moment, I had so many friends and colleagues in the arts sector saying they were now going to examine their own institution for institutional racism. And I would make the point every single time, I didn't know you were racist, right? So there was this kind of sort of weird thing that happened to people that they had to feel seen to be doing something about this Black Lives Matter moment. And in actual fact, maybe that comes from a good place, but think about the consequences of your actions, OK? Because the whole gains of liberal society was the universalisation of the human experience, the fact that we all have something deeply in common that unites us.
Yeah, well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Mo Lovatt, thanks so much for joining me today.